Wait, I'm the one who called.
Hands up, don't move.
I called you. I'm the victim.
Get on the ground.
Ow!
Okay.
It's hot.
Down, face down.
Relax, man.
Ow. Hey, stop resisting. Hands behind your back.
There is a moment that happens in almost every encounter between a citizen and a law enforcement officer, a split second where everything hangs in the balance. The officer makes a decision, the citizen responds, and in that instant, the entire trajectory of both their lives can change forever. Sometimes that decision is measured, professional, and fair. Other times, it is fueled by ego, prejudice, or a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to serve and protect. Today, we are going to examine 4 separate incidents from across the United States. 4 encounters that were captured on body cameras. 4 stories where officers made choices that would ultimately cost them their careers. These are not isolated incidents of minor misconduct. These are cases where the power of the badge was wielded as a weapon against innocent people, people who were doing nothing wrong, people who expected protection and instead received harassment, intimidation, and in some cases, unlawful arrest. If you have ever wondered what accountability looks like when an officer crosses the line, stay with me until the end. The conclusions of these stories might surprise you, and if this is the kind of content that matters to you, consider subscribing now so you do not miss the deeper examinations of justice and power that we explore on this channel. Let us begin. The afternoon sun beat down on the sprawling parking lot of a massive travel center just outside of Bayview, Texas. It was April 23rd, 2023, a Sunday afternoon that should have been unremarkable. The travel center was one of those enormous complexes that dot the Texas highways, a place where weary travelers stop to refuel their vehicles, grab a snack, and stretch their legs before continuing on their journeys. Dozens of cars move through the lot at any given moment, weaving between rows of gas pumps, navigating around families loading coolers into their trunks, avoiding the occasional shopping cart someone had pushed too far from the entrance. Michael Brennan had just finished filling up his silver Honda Accord. He was a man in his early 40s with the kind of quiet demeanor that suggested he had long ago learned to avoid unnecessary conflict. His errands that day had been mundane. A few purchases at a hardware store, some groceries for the week ahead. Now he was heading home, following the same route he had driven hundreds of times before. As Michael pulled away from the gas pump, he glanced in his rearview mirror. Nothing unusual, just the typical Sunday chaos of a busy travel center. He accelerated gently through the parking lot, keeping his speed reasonable, his eyes scanning for pedestrians and other vehicles. The exit was just ahead. In another 30 seconds, he would be on the access road, then merging onto the highway, and then home. That was when he noticed the patrol car behind him. The lights were not on yet. The vehicle was simply following. Michael felt that familiar tightening in his chest that many drivers experience when they realize a police car is behind them. He checked his speedometer out of habit. He was moving slowly, well under any reasonable limit for a parking lot. He had made no illegal turns. He had stopped completely at the internal stop signs. There was no reason for concern. And then the lights came on. Michael felt confusion wash over him as he guided his vehicle to the side of the access road just outside the travel center property. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they would be visible. Whatever this was about, he intended to be cooperative, to resolve any misunderstanding quickly, and to continue on his way. Officer Derek Martell approached the driver's side window. He was a man in his mid-30s with a shaved head and the kind of rigid posture that suggested someone who took his authority very seriously. His uniform was crisp. His badge gleamed in the afternoon sunlight. Everything about his appearance projected professionalism, but appearances can be deceiving. Michael rolled down his window and looked up at the officer. His expression was open, curious, perhaps slightly worried, but not defensive. He had done nothing wrong, and he knew it. He simply wanted to understand why he had been stopped. The officer wasted no time. His voice was clipped, almost irritated, as if Michael had already committed some offense simply by existing. He asked for license and registration in that flat, mechanical way that officers use when they have already decided the tenor of the encounter. Michael complied immediately, reaching slowly for his wallet, explaining each movement before he made it. He had learned long ago that clarity and transparency were essential during traffic stops, especially for men who looked like him. What followed was an accusation that Michael could not have anticipated. The officer claimed that Michael had been speeding through the parking lot, that his reckless driving had nearly caused an accident, that a white pickup truck had almost collided with another vehicle while trying to avoid Michael's dangerous maneuvers. Michael's brow furrowed. He replayed the last few minutes in his mind. He had driven through that parking lot at a cautious pace, as he always did. He had seen no near accident. He had heard no screeching tires, no honking horns, nothing that would suggest the chaos the officer was describing. He tried to explain this calmly and respectfully. He acknowledged that he had been driving through the parking lot. Of course he had, but he disputed the characterization of his driving as reckless or dangerous. He had been careful. He was always careful. The officer's response was immediate and dismissive. He told Michael that he did not appreciate the attitude, that Michael's attempt to explain himself was somehow disrespectful, that this attitude was precisely why he was going to receive a citation. Let us pause here for a moment to consider what had just happened. A citizen was pulled over based on a vague accusation. He attempted to provide his perspective, as anyone would, and his simple act of speaking, of trying to engage in a dialogue about the facts, was characterized as attitude that warranted punishment. This is a phenomenon that legal scholars and civil rights advocates have documented extensively. It has been called contempt of cop, the informal practice of using the power of citation or arrest to punish citizens who are perceived as insufficiently deferential, regardless of whether they have committed any actual offense. It is not illegal to have an attitude. It is not illegal to ask questions. It is not illegal to express disagreement with an officer's assessment of a situation. But in the hands of certain officers, these perfectly legal behaviors become pretexts for punishment. Officer Martell informed Michael that he would be receiving a citation for disregarding a traffic control device. Michael was confused by this. He had stopped at every stop sign in the parking lot. He had obeyed every posted indication. What traffic control device had he allegedly disregarded? The answer reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the law, or perhaps a willful misapplication of it. The officer was attempting to apply a traffic statute that governed the disregarding of traffic control devices, but there was a crucial limitation to that statute, one that the officer either did not know or chose to ignore. Under Texas law, that particular provision applied only to public roadways and public property. A private parking lot, even one as large as the travel center where this encounter originated, was not subject to those regulations. The stop signs in that parking lot were courtesies, aids to safe navigation, not legally enforceable traffic control devices. Michael tried to explain this. He was familiar with the distinction between public and private property in traffic law. He pointed out that the travel center was private property, that the statutes the officer was citing did not apply. He was not being argumentative. He was simply trying to clarify a legal misunderstanding before it escalated further. The officer's response was chilling. He told Michael that he would be arrested if he did not stop talking, that Michael was on the verge of being charged with a Class B reckless driving offense, that such a charge would result in jail time. Think about this for a moment. A man stops for gas. He drives carefully through a parking lot. He is pulled over for reasons he cannot understand. He politely tries to explain his perspective and clarify what he believes is a legal misunderstanding. And now he is being threatened with jail. The body camera footage captured what happened next. Officer Martell told Michael that he was going to receive a citation, that his attitude had guaranteed it. But then something strange occurred. The officer patted his pockets, checked his vehicle, and announced that he had run out of citation forms. He could not actually write the ticket he had threatened. For a brief moment, it seemed like the encounter might end. A frustrated officer, unable to follow through on his threat, might simply let the matter go. Michael certainly hoped for that outcome. He remained in his vehicle, hands visible, waiting to be told he could leave. But Officer Martell was not finished. His ego had been bruised by what he perceived as Michael's disrespect. His inability to write a citation had only deepened his frustration, and so he made a decision that would prove to be his undoing. He ordered Michael out of the vehicle. He told him he was being placed under arrest. Michael's confusion transformed into fear. Arrest? For what? He had been accused of a parking lot violation that did not exist under the applicable law. He had been threatened with a citation that could not be written, and now he was being arrested. He asked the question that any reasonable person would ask. What was the charge? What crime had he committed that warranted being taken into custody? The officer's answer was telling. He said he was concerned that Michael would continue to engage in the unsafe behavior he had allegedly witnessed, that this concern justified taking Michael into custody. This is what legal scholars call pre-crime reasoning. The notion that someone can be detained not for what they have done, but for what an officer believes they might do in the future. It is a concept that has no place in American jurisprudence. You cannot arrest someone for potential future conduct. You cannot deprive someone of their liberty based on your speculation about their intentions. And yet, that is precisely what happened. Michael was handcuffed. He was placed in the back of the patrol car. His vehicle was left on the side of the road. His afternoon was destroyed. His sense of safety and trust in law enforcement was shattered. The drive to the county detention facility was silent. Michael sat in the back of the patrol car, his wrists aching from the tight handcuffs, his mind racing through everything that had just happened. How had a routine gas station stop turned into this? What had he done to deserve being treated like a criminal? The answer, of course, was nothing. He had done nothing. He had been punished for having the audacity to speak, to explain, to assert his understanding of the law. He had been punished for failing to perform the submissive deference that Officer Martell apparently expected from all citizens, regardless of whether that deference was warranted or legally required. I want you to think about how you would feel in that situation. Imagine being pulled over for something you did not do. Imagine trying to have a calm, rational conversation about the facts. Imagine being told that your attempt to communicate was an attitude problem. And imagine being hauled off to jail because an officer did not like the way you spoke to him. If you have never experienced something like this, it might seem impossible. Surely you might think, there are protections against this kind of abuse. Surely the system would catch this error and correct it. But for Michael Brennan, sitting in the back of that patrol car on that Sunday afternoon, those protections felt very far away. Michael was processed at the county facility. Fingerprints, photographs, the dehumanizing ritual that accompanies any arrest, regardless of guilt or innocence. He was placed in a holding cell with others who had been swept up by the system that day, some for serious offenses, others for matters as trivial as his own alleged crime. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The concrete bench beneath him grew harder with each passing minute. Michael thought about his family, who would be wondering where he was. He thought about his job, and whether this arrest would appear on his record, and what implications it might have for his future. He thought about the fundamental unfairness of it all. Eventually, he was released. The charges, such as they were, could not withstand any serious scrutiny. There was no legitimate basis for the arrest. The traffic violation that Officer Martell had attempted to cite did not apply to private property. The arrest itself was predicated on nothing more than the officer's displeasure at being questioned, but the experience had left its mark. Michael Brennan would carry the memory of that day for the rest of his life. The feeling of the handcuffs on his wrists, the humiliation of being paraded into a detention facility, the helplessness of being at the mercy of someone who had clearly abused his authority. What Michael did not know as he drove home that evening was that Officer Martell's body camera had captured everything. Every word, every threat, every abuse of power. That footage would soon become the instrument of accountability that Michael himself could never have achieved alone. Within days, the footage was reviewed by supervisors at the Bayview Police Department. What they saw disturbed them. An officer making up charges, threatening arrest over a non-existent violation, actually following through on that threat when the citizen dared to push back. This was not aggressive policing or zealous enforcement of the law. This was something else entirely. The department launched an internal investigation. Witnesses were interviewed. The legal basis for the stop and subsequent arrest was examined, and the conclusion was unambiguous. Officer Derek Martell had violated department policy in multiple ways. He had fabricated a legal justification for the stop. He had escalated a minor encounter into a custodial arrest without proper cause. He had used his badge as a weapon against an innocent citizen. Chief Rebecca Thornton held a press conference 3 weeks after the incident. Her expression was grave as she faced the assembled reporters. She acknowledged that the footage was difficult to watch. She stated that the officer's conduct did not represent the values of the Bayview Police Department, and she announced that Officer Martell had been terminated effective immediately. It was a moment of accountability, a rare instance where the system actually worked as it was supposed to. An officer who abused his power faced consequences. A citizen who had been wronged saw justice, even if that justice could never fully repair the damage that had been done. But here is the question that lingers. How many encounters like this one are never captured on camera? How many citizens are arrested, charged, and even convicted based on the word of officers who behave like Derek Martell? How many people suffer in silence because there is no footage to corroborate their version of events? The body camera revealed the truth in this case, but the body camera only exists because of decades of advocacy, because of other cases where there was no footage and justice was denied. Michael Brennan's vindication was built on the suffering of countless others who came before him, who told their stories and were not believed. Take a moment to consider that. And if you appreciate deep examinations of cases like this one, if you want to understand not just what happened, but why it matters, make sure you are subscribed to this channel. There is much more to explore. Our second story takes us to the Atlantic coast of Florida, to a wealthy suburb called Coral Palm Gardens. It was a Wednesday afternoon, May 11th, 2023, and the community pool at the Seaside Villas condominium complex was experiencing the kind of minor dispute that happens in shared spaces everywhere. Two residents had a disagreement. Harsh words were exchanged, and what should have been a trivial matter between neighbors escalated into something far more serious because of the choices made by a responding officer. Ryan Chen was relaxing by the pool when the trouble began. He was a financial analyst in his late 30s, a man who had lived in the Seaside Villas complex for nearly 4 years. He knew most of his neighbors, at least by sight, and he generally enjoyed the community amenities. The pool was one of his favorite features, a place to unwind after long days of staring at spreadsheets and market projections. On the lounge chair next to him, his phone rested beside a half-finished novel. The afternoon sun warmed his skin as he watched other residents come and go. Children splashed in the shallow end. An elderly couple sat under an umbrella sharing a pitcher of lemonade. It was peaceful, unremarkable, exactly what a Wednesday afternoon should be. Then Maria Petrov arrived. Maria was a newer resident, having moved into the complex only a few months earlier with her husband Victor. She was in her late 20s with the kind of confident bearing that suggested she was accustomed to getting her way. She spread her towel on a lounge chair just a few feet from Ryan and immediately began rearranging the poolside furniture to better suit her preferences. Ryan barely noticed at first. People adjusted furniture all the time. But then Maria moved his phone, shifting it from the small table where he had placed it to make room for her own belongings. He looked up, mildly annoyed. What followed was a minor argument, the kind that happens in shared spaces when personalities clash. Ryan asked Maria not to touch his belongings. Maria responded dismissively, suggesting that Ryan did not own the poolside tables and should not expect exclusive use of them. Voices were raised, though neither party became physically aggressive. Other pool users glanced over, mildly curious, then returned to their own activities. It should have ended there. A petty squabble between neighbors that would be forgotten by the following week. Perhaps they would avoid each other in the future. Perhaps they would eventually laugh about it. Either way, it was the kind of thing adults typically resolve without outside intervention. But Maria did not let it end. She pulled out her phone and called her husband. Victor Petrov arrived at the pool approximately 15 minutes later. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention. His expression was dark as he approached the pool area, his eyes scanning for the man who had allegedly disrespected his wife. When he spotted Ryan still lounging on his chair, Victor walked directly toward him. His stride was purposeful, aggressive. Other pool users noticed the change in atmosphere and began gathering their belongings, sensing that something unpleasant was about to happen. Victor stopped a few feet from Ryan's chair and began speaking. His voice was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He accused Ryan of harassing his wife. He demanded an apology. He made it clear that disrespect toward Maria would not be tolerated. Ryan stood, not to fight, but because lying on a lounge chair while being confronted by an angry man felt vulnerable. He tried to explain what had actually happened. He said the disagreement was mutual and minor. He pointed out that Maria had touched his belongings first, which had started the whole exchange. Victor did not want explanations. He wanted submission. And when he did not get it, he did something that transformed the entire situation. He lifted his shirt to reveal the handgun holstered on his hip. This was not a threat in the technical sense. Victor did not draw the weapon. He did not point it at Ryan. He did not explicitly say he would use it. But the message was unmistakable. I am armed. You are not. Think carefully about your next words. Ryan felt his stomach drop. The pool area, which moments before had been a place of relaxation, suddenly felt like a trap. He was standing in swimming trunks, no shoes, no phone within easy reach, facing an angry man with a gun who clearly wanted to intimidate him into submission. He made a decision that almost certainly saved him from further escalation. He did not respond to Victor's display. He did not challenge him. He simply turned, walked to the pool office, and asked the attendant to call the police. Victor, apparently satisfied that he had made his point, left the pool area with Maria. Ryan remained in the office, waiting for law enforcement to arrive, replaying the encounter in his mind. A man had displayed a firearm during an argument over pool furniture. This was exactly the kind of situation that required professional intervention. Officer Christina Valdez arrived approximately 12 minutes later. She was a patrol officer with the Coral Palm Gardens Police Department, a woman in her early 30s who had been on the force for just under 3 years. Her body camera was recording as she stepped out of her patrol vehicle and approached the pool complex. What happened next would become the subject of intense scrutiny. Ryan was sitting on a bench outside the pool office when Officer Valdez arrived. He stood when he saw her, relieved that help had finally come. He started to walk toward her, intending to explain what had happened and describe the man who had threatened him. Officer Valdez's reaction was immediate and aggressive. She drew her service weapon and pointed it directly at Ryan's chest. The commands came rapid fire. Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them. Do not move. Ryan froze, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He was the one who had called for help. He was the victim. He was standing there in swimming trunks, obviously unarmed, clearly not a threat. Why was there a gun pointed at him? He tried to speak, to explain that he had called 911, that he was the complainant, that the person she should be looking for was the armed man who had already left the scene. The officer did not want to hear it. She repeated her commands louder this time. She ordered Ryan to shut his mouth. She told him he was being detained for his own safety. She threatened to charge him with resisting if he did not comply immediately. Ryan complied. What choice did he have? There was a gun pointed at him by someone who clearly was not interested in listening. He lowered himself to the ground, his knees scraping against the rough concrete, his hands pressing flat against the warm pavement. He felt the officer's knee in his back as she secured him in handcuffs. This moment deserves our full attention. A citizen calls 911 to report being threatened by an armed man. The police arrive, and instead of helping the victim, the responding officer draws her weapon on him, forces him to the ground, and places him in handcuffs. How does this happen? The body camera footage provides some clues, though it raises as many questions as it answers. It appears that Officer Valdez received information that there had been a disturbance at the pool involving a man with a gun. The description she received was vague. She knew there was a male involved. She knew there had been a confrontation. She knew someone was reportedly armed. When she arrived and saw Ryan walking toward her, she made a split-second assumption. She assumed he was the threat. She assumed he was the one she had been warned about. She assumed wrong. It is worth considering why she might have made this assumption. Ryan Chen was the only person visible when she arrived. He was moving toward her, which she may have interpreted as aggressive rather than cooperative, and he was a man, which matched the limited description she had received. But here is what she should have noticed. Ryan was wearing swimming trunks and nothing else. No shirt, no pockets large enough to conceal a weapon. His hands were empty and visible. There was literally nowhere on his body where he could have been hiding a firearm. A careful, observant officer would have recognized this immediately. A careful, observant officer would have asked questions before drawing a weapon. Officer Valdez was not careful or observant in that moment. She saw what she expected to see, what she feared to see. Rather than what was actually in front of her, Ryan lay on the hot concrete, his wrists bound behind his back, trying to explain through the weight of the officer's knee on his spine. He told her his name. He told her he had called 911. He told her the armed man had already left with his wife. He begged her to check the dispatch records to confirm that he was the one who had reported the incident. The officer's response was infuriating in its dismissiveness. She told Ryan that he had failed to follow her commands, that his failure to comply was the reason he was being detained, that whether he was the original caller was irrelevant to the fact that he had not immediately dropped to the ground when ordered. This is circular logic that has been used to justify wrongful detentions countless times. An officer makes a mistake in identifying a suspect. The innocent person, confused and frightened, does not immediately comply with commands that make no sense to them. The officer then uses that non-compliance as justification for the detention, even though the detention itself was baseless. Ryan was lifted from the ground and placed in the back of the patrol car. His wrists ached from the handcuffs, which had been cinched too tight. His knees were scraped and bleeding from being forced onto the concrete, and his mind was reeling from the absolute injustice of what was happening. He kept trying to explain. Through the partition in the patrol car, he told Officer Valdez again that she had the wrong person. He described Victor Petrov, the actual armed man. He described Maria, the wife. He told her they lived in the complex and could easily be located. He provided every detail he could think of that might help her understand her mistake. Officer Valdez was unmoved. She had already committed to her version of events. Admitting that she had drawn her weapon on an innocent man, forced him to the ground, and handcuffed him would mean admitting she had made a serious error. It is psychologically difficult for anyone to do this in the moment, and it seems to be particularly difficult for some law enforcement officers who've been trained to project confidence and control at all times. So instead of reconsidering, she doubled down. She told Ryan that he was being transported to the station for questioning, that he would have an opportunity to tell his side of the story there, that his continued insistence that she had made a mistake was itself becoming a problem. Think about what message this sends. A citizen does everything right. He removes himself from a dangerous situation. He calls the police. He waits calmly for them to arrive. He tries to cooperate when they show up. And he is treated like a criminal anyway. What lesson is he supposed to take from this experience? What lesson are the rest of us supposed to take? I would love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a situation where police seem to have their mind made up before they even assess the scene? What do you think causes this kind of tunnel vision? Share your perspectives below. The ride to the Coral Palm Gardens police station was silent, except for Ryan's occasional attempts to get Officer Valdez to listen. She did not respond. Her jaw was set, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Whatever internal process was happening in her mind, it did not include reconsidering her assessment of the situation. At the station, Ryan was placed in an interview room. The handcuffs were removed, but he was not allowed to leave. He was told that detectives would be with him shortly to take his statement. No one told him what he was being charged with. No one told him how long he would be held. He simply sat in that small room, watching the minutes tick by on the clock on the wall. Nearly 3 hours passed. During that time, something important was happening elsewhere in the station. Another officer, a detective named Marcus Webb, was reviewing the body camera footage from Officer Valdez's response. Detective Webb was a 15-year veteran of the department, someone with enough experience to recognize when something had gone badly wrong. What he saw on the footage disturbed him. He watched as Officer Valdez arrived at the pool complex. He saw Ryan Chen stand up from the bench, his posture clearly non-threatening. He watched the officer draw her weapon on a man who was obviously unarmed. He heard Ryan's confused protests, his attempts to explain that he was the one who had called for help. And he heard Officer Valdez dismiss those explanations, insisting on compliance despite the obvious mistake she had made. Detective Webb pulled up the dispatch records. There it was, in black and white. Ryan Chen had called 911 at 3:47 p.m. to report being threatened by an armed man at the Seaside Villas pool. The caller had provided his name, his unit number, and a description of the suspect. Everything Ryan had said from the moment Officer Valdez arrived was consistent with the dispatch records. The detective walked to the interview room where Ryan had been waiting. He opened the door and saw a man sitting with his head in his hands, exhausted, confused, and deeply frustrated. Detective Webb introduced himself and apologized. The apology was sincere, but it was not enough. Nothing could erase the experience Ryan had just been through. Nothing could undo the moment when a gun had been pointed at his chest for no reason. Nothing could restore the sense of safety and trust that had been shattered. Ryan was released without charges. Detective Webb drove him back to the pool complex personally, an unusual gesture that spoke to the officer's understanding of just how badly his colleague had erred. On the drive, the detective explained that there would be an internal investigation, that Officer Valdez's conduct would be reviewed, that Ryan had every right to file a formal complaint. Ryan did file that complaint, and the investigation that followed was swift and thorough. The findings were damning. Officer Valdez had failed to properly assess the scene before drawing her weapon. She had ignored obvious indicators that Ryan was not the suspect she was looking for. She had dismissed his attempts to explain the situation without even verifying his claims. She had detained him for hours based on her initial mistaken assumption, rather than acknowledging her error and releasing him promptly. And she had shown no remorse or recognition that anything had gone wrong. 6 weeks after the incident, Officer Christina Valdez was terminated from the Coral Palm Gardens Police Department. The official statement cited multiple violations of department policy, including improper use of force, failure to conduct adequate scene assessment, and conduct unbecoming an officer. For Ryan Chen, the termination provided some measure of closure, but the scars remained. He found himself nervous around police officers in ways he had never been before. He flinched when he saw patrol cars in his neighborhood. He had nightmares about lying face down on hot concrete, unable to move, unable to make anyone listen. And Viktor Petrov, the man who had actually displayed a firearm during an argument, he was eventually interviewed by detectives and issued a warning about his conduct. No charges were filed. His wife Maria continued to use the pool as if nothing had happened. There is something deeply troubling about this disparity in outcomes. The actual aggressor received a warning. The victim was tackled, handcuffed, and detained for hours. Yes, the officer was eventually fired. Yes, some form of accountability was achieved, but the fundamental imbalance remains disturbing. What does it tell us about how our systems operate? What does it reveal about who is seen as threatening and who is seen as deserving protection? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are questions we must continue to ask. Our third story is perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. It involves a vulnerable person, a crowded store, and an officer who seemed incapable of basic human compassion. The date was August 21st, 2022. The location was a large Target store in Riverside, New Mexico, a growing suburb on the outskirts of Albuquerque. The afternoon sun streamed through the store's front windows, illuminating the checkout area where a drama was about to unfold. Harold Simmons was 55 years old. He had lived with cognitive disabilities his entire life, the result of complications during his birth that had affected his brain development. He functioned well enough to live semi-independently in a group home with support from caretakers who checked on him daily. He could handle basic tasks like shopping for groceries, though he sometimes struggled with more complex situations. On this particular afternoon, Harold had walked to the Target store to purchase a bicycle. It was something he had been saving for over many months, carefully setting aside small amounts from his disability benefits until he had enough. The bicycle represented freedom to him, the ability to travel around his neighborhood without depending on others for rides. He had been thinking about it for a long time, and now he finally had enough money to make the purchase. Harold found the bicycle he wanted in the sporting goods section. It was a simple model, dark blue with silver handlebars, nothing fancy but exactly what he needed. He wheeled it carefully to the front of the store, navigating around other shoppers with the deliberate concentration of someone who took such tasks very seriously. At the self-checkout area, Harold encountered a problem. The self-checkout machines were designed for scanning items and paying with cards. They were not optimized for someone who wanted to pay with cash, which was all Harold had. The bills and coins he had accumulated were tucked into a small fanny pack around his waist, a pack he kept secured tightly because he knew how important the money inside was. Harold stood at the self-checkout kiosk, the bicycle beside him, trying to figure out what to do. He could see the cash acceptor on the machine, but he was having difficulty getting the bills out of his fanny pack. The zipper was stuck, or his fingers were not cooperating the way he wanted them to, or he simply could not remember which pocket held which denominations. His frustration was visible in his furrowed brow and the small sounds of distress he was making. A store employee noticed him struggling and asked if he needed help. Harold tried to explain, but his words came out jumbled. The employee, unfortunately, misinterpreted the situation. She saw a man fumbling with a fanny pack next to an unpaid bicycle and jumped to an unfortunate conclusion. She walked away to find security. What happened next might have been resolved quickly and compassionately by someone with patience and training in dealing with individuals who have cognitive disabilities. Instead, the employee found Officer Bradley Henning of the Riverside Police Department, who happened to be in the store on an unrelated matter. Officer Henning approached Harold at the self-checkout. His body language was immediately confrontational. He asked Harold what he was doing. He demanded to know if Harold intended to pay for the bicycle. He spoke in rapid, clipped sentences that Harold struggled to process. Harold tried to explain. He pointed to his fanny pack. He said he had money. He said he wanted to buy the bicycle. He was doing his best to communicate, but his words were coming out slowly, and the officer seemed unwilling to give him the time he needed. Officer Henning grew impatient. He told Harold that he needed to leave the store, that he was causing a disturbance, that if he did not leave immediately, he would be arrested for trespassing. Harold did not understand. He had money. He wanted to buy the bicycle. Why was he being told to leave? His confusion manifested as immobility. He simply stood there, trying to process what was happening, unable to reconcile the officer's demands with his own intentions. The officer interpreted this immobility as defiance. He reached for Harold's arm and began to pull him away from the checkout area. What followed was captured in excruciating detail on Officer Henning's body camera. Harold resisted the pulling, not aggressively, not violently, but with the instinctive resistance of someone who did not understand why they were being moved against their will. He kept saying he had money. He kept pointing to his fanny pack. He kept trying to explain. Officer Henning escalated. He pushed Harold against a display case. He shouted commands into Harold's face. He threatened him with charges of criminal trespassing, concealing identity, and resisting officers. Each threat was delivered at a volume and speed that would have been overwhelming for anyone, let alone someone with cognitive disabilities. Other shoppers stopped to watch. Some pulled out their phones to record. A mother covered her young child's eyes and hurried toward the exit. The scene was disturbing to witness. A uniformed officer physically confronting a middle-aged man who was clearly confused and frightened. Harold began to cry, not dramatically, not performatively, but with the quiet, helpless tears of someone who simply did not understand why the world had suddenly become so hostile. The tears ran down his cheeks as Officer Henning continued his tirade. At some point during the confrontation, Harold said something that should have given any reasonable officer pause. He said that he did not realize they were police. He thought they were store security. This statement revealed the depth of his confusion. He was not resisting a police officer. He was resisting what he perceived as a store employee who was treating him unfairly. Officer Henning's response was dismissive. He said it was not their fault that Harold had not looked carefully enough, that the uniform clearly identified him as law enforcement, that Harold's failure to recognize this was his own problem, not a reason for leniency. This response completely ignores the reality of cognitive disabilities. Individuals like Harold often struggle with processing visual information, especially in stressful situations. The ability to quickly assess uniforms and identify authority figures is not something that can be taken for granted. A compassionate officer would have recognized this. A compassionate officer would have slowed down, identified himself clearly, and given Harold time to understand. Officer Henning was not compassionate. He was frustrated, impatient, and apparently determined to assert his authority regardless of the circumstances. The confrontation ended with Harold being forced out of the store. He did not get his bicycle. He did not get to explain about the money in his fanny pack. He was simply expelled from a place of business for the crime of shopping while disabled. But the story does not end there, because Officer Henning made a decision that would prove to be his undoing. He filed a police report about the incident. That report was a work of fiction. It described Harold as aggressive and combative. It claimed Harold had threatened store employees. It stated that Harold had refused to identify himself when asked. It characterized the encounter as a dangerous situation that Officer Henning had resolved through professional intervention. None of this was true. The body camera footage showed a confused, frightened man who had done nothing wrong. It showed an officer who escalated a simple misunderstanding into a traumatic confrontation. It showed a failure of basic human decency. The Riverside Police Department reviewed the footage. They compared it to the written report. The discrepancies were glaring, undeniable, and deeply troubling. Officer Bradley Henning was terminated immediately. But that was not all. The department, recognizing the severity of the misconduct, referred the matter to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The charges filed against Officer Henning were serious. False imprisonment, a fourth-degree felony. Perjury, also a fourth-degree felony. For the lies in his official report, filing a false police report, a misdemeanor, battery for the physical force used against Harold. This was accountability of a kind that is distressingly rare. Officers who abuse their power often face nothing more than administrative discipline, if they face anything at all. The fact that Henning was criminally charged sent a powerful message. It said that the badge does not provide immunity for cruelty. It said that lying in official reports has consequences. It said that vulnerable people deserve protection, not persecution. For Harold Simmons, the aftermath was difficult. He was shaken by the experience, more anxious about going out in public, more fearful of encounters with authority figures. His caretakers at the group home noticed the change in him. He was quieter, more withdrawn, less likely to venture out on his own. But there was also healing. A victim's advocate from the district attorney's office reached out to Harold. She helped him understand what had happened and what was being done about it. She arranged for him to receive counseling, and she made sure that he eventually got his bicycle, purchased with the same money he had been trying to spend on that terrible day. The story of Harold Simmons is a reminder of how much damage can be done by those who are supposed to protect. It is also a reminder that accountability, when it happens, can make a difference. Officer Henning will face trial for his actions. Harold will have his day in court, an opportunity to see the man who terrorized him held responsible. Justice is often slow. It is often imperfect. But in this case, it appears to be happening. If you are still with me at this point in the video, I want to thank you for your attention. These stories are not easy to hear. They involve real pain, real injustice, real failures of systems that are supposed to serve all of us equally. But hearing them matters. Understanding them matters. Sharing them matters. If this content resonates with you, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. Together, we can ensure that these stories reach more people, that more light is shown on the shadows where abuse of power thrives. Our final story takes us to the desert Southwest, to a hotel in Chandler, Arizona. The date was August 31st, 2020. The incident would expose not just individual misconduct, but a pattern of racial bias that continues to plague American policing. The Oasis Inn was a modest establishment on the outskirts of Chandler, a 3-story building that catered primarily to business travelers and families visiting the greater Phoenix area. It was not fancy, but it was clean and well-maintained, the kind of place where guests could expect a reasonable night's sleep at a reasonable price. Marcus Thompson had worked at the Oasis Inn for nearly 3 years. He was 28 years old, a black man who had grown up in the area and took pride in his work as a night shift supervisor. His responsibilities included managing the front desk, coordinating with housekeeping, and handling any issues that arose during the overnight hours when other management was not present. On this particular evening, Marcus was dealing with a situation that required delicate handling. A couple staying in one of the third-floor rooms had been caught smoking in the stairwell, a violation of hotel policy. The housekeeping staff had reported seeing them and smelling the smoke. Marcus went to investigate. He climbed the stairs to the third floor and found the couple, a white man and woman who appeared to be in their late 30s. They were standing in the stairwell landing, the remains of their cigarettes still visible on the concrete floor. Marcus approached them professionally. He explained that smoking was prohibited in all interior areas of the hotel. He asked them to please refrain from doing so in the future. His tone was courteous, the tone of someone who had delivered similar messages many times before and knew how to do so without creating unnecessary conflict. The man's response was hostile. He stepped toward Marcus aggressively and told him to mind his own business. He used language that suggested Marcus had no authority to tell him what to do. And then, in a move that changed the tenor of the entire encounter, he lifted his shirt to reveal a handgun tucked into his waistband. This was the second time in our series of stories that someone has displayed a firearm to intimidate another person. And once again, It transformed a minor dispute into something potentially deadly. Marcus stepped back immediately. His heart was pounding. His survival instincts were screaming at him to get away from this man. But he also felt a responsibility. He was the supervisor on duty. These people were guests in his hotel, and there were other guests and staff members who could potentially be in danger from someone willing to display a weapon over a minor policy reminder. He told the couple that they needed to leave the hotel, that their behavior was unacceptable, that he was going to call the police. The man laughed. He grabbed the woman's arm and they descended the stairs, passing Marcus on their way down. Marcus followed at a safe distance, making sure they were actually leaving the property and not heading toward the lobby or other occupied areas. From his position on the stairs, Marcus watched the couple exit through the rear entrance of the hotel. They got into a white pickup truck and drove away. Marcus noted the vehicle description and the direction they went, then returned to the front desk to call the police. The 911 call was recorded, as all such calls are. Marcus clearly identified himself as a hotel employee. He described the incident. He provided a description of the suspects. A white male, approximately 40 years old, medium build, wearing a gray t-shirt. A white female, similar age, blonde hair, white pickup truck, headed eastbound on Canyon Road. The dispatcher acknowledged the information and said officers would be sent to investigate. Marcus hung up and waited. He felt shaken by the encounter, by the casual way the man had displayed his weapon, by the implied threat in that gesture. But he also felt he had done the right thing. He had documented the incident. He had reported it to police. He had protected his hotel and the people in it. About 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into the hotel parking lot. Officer Daniel Russo stepped out and approached the entrance. Marcus saw him through the lobby windows and went out to meet him. He wanted to provide whatever additional information might help locate the couple, who were presumably still driving around somewhere with an apparently unstable armed man at the wheel. What happened next was captured on Officer Russo's body camera. It was also captured on the hotel's security cameras, and it became one of the most discussed examples of racial profiling to emerge from that period. As Marcus walked toward Officer Russo, his hands clearly visible, his hotel name tag clearly displayed on his chest, the officer drew his weapon. The commands were familiar by now. Get on the ground. Hands where I can see them. Do not move. Marcus froze. His mind, like Ryan Chen's in our earlier story, struggled to process what was happening. He was wearing his uniform. He was in front of his place of employment. He had been the one to call for help. Why was there a gun pointed at him? He tried to speak. He identified himself as the hotel employee who had called 911. He pointed to his name tag. He kept his hands raised and visible. Officer Russo was not interested. He continued shouting commands. He ordered Marcus to get on the ground. He threatened to deploy his taser if Marcus did not comply immediately. Marcus lowered himself to the ground, his face pressing against the asphalt of the parking lot. He felt the officer's knee on his back, the familiar posture of detention. He heard the handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. While this was happening, Marcus could hear Officer Russo's radio. The dispatcher was providing additional information about the call, and Marcus heard something that chilled him. The officer asked the dispatcher a question. He asked whether the suspect was a white male or a black male. The dispatcher, clearly confused, repeated the description that Marcus himself had provided. White male, approximately 40 years old, gray t-shirt. There was a pause. Then Officer Russo asked again, with what sounded like skepticism in his voice. He wanted confirmation. White male. Was the dispatcher sure? Marcus lay on the ground, handcuffed. Listening to this exchange, he understood what was happening. The officer had seen a black man in the parking lot and had assumed that black man must be the suspect, despite the clear description in the dispatch, despite the fact that Marcus was obviously an employee of the hotel, despite every piece of evidence suggesting that he was the wrong person. This is racial profiling in its most naked form. The officer had information about the suspect's race. He encountered someone of a different race, and he detained the person in front of him anyway because his assumptions about who posed a threat did not align with the actual facts of the situation. The hotel manager, a woman named Patricia Reyes, had been watching from inside the lobby. She came running out when she saw Marcus being handcuffed. Her voice was frantic as she tried to explain to Officer Russo that he had made a mistake. She told the officer that Marcus was her employee, that he had been the one to call the police, that he had been trying to help. She pointed to his name tag, his uniform, the hotel logo on his shirt. Officer Russo's response was dismissive. He told Patricia that he was conducting an investigation and that she needed to step back. He told her he would sort out who was who once he had the situation under control, but the situation was already under control. There was no threat. There was only a hotel supervisor lying face down in his own parking lot, detained by an officer who could not see past the color of his skin. Several minutes passed. Marcus remained on the ground. Patricia continued to advocate for him, providing more details, asking the officer to check the security footage, demanding to know why her employee was being treated like a criminal. Eventually, Officer Russo seemed to reach some internal conclusion. He removed the handcuffs from Marcus's wrists and allowed him to stand. His explanation for the detention was thin. He said he was responding to a report of an armed individual and needed to secure the scene. He said Marcus should understand that officer safety required caution. What he did not do was apologize. What he did not do was acknowledge that he had made a mistake. What he did not do was show any recognition that he had just subjected an innocent man to a humiliating and frightening experience based on nothing more than racial assumptions. Instead, he simply told Marcus to have a great afternoon, as if the last several minutes had been a minor inconvenience rather than a traumatic encounter with armed authority. Marcus stood in the parking lot, rubbing his wrists where the handcuffs had dug in. He watched Officer Russo get back in his patrol car and drive away. The white couple in the pickup truck, the actual suspects, were never found. In the days that followed, Marcus Thompson struggled with what had happened. He found it difficult to sleep. He replayed the encounter over and over in his mind. He questioned whether he had done something wrong, whether there was something he could have said or done differently to prevent being detained. This is a common response among victims of police misconduct. Even when they have done nothing wrong, even when the fault lies entirely with the officer, victims often search for ways they might have prevented their own mistreatment. It is a coping mechanism, an attempt to restore a sense of control in a world that has suddenly revealed itself to be arbitrary and unjust. Marcus's family encouraged him to file a complaint. His mother, who had experienced her own encounters with discriminatory policing over the years, told him that staying silent would only allow the behavior to continue. His brother, a civil rights attorney in Phoenix, offered to help navigate the process. Marcus filed a formal complaint with the Chandler Police Department. He provided his own account of the incident. He referenced the body camera footage and the hotel security recordings. He asked that Officer Russo be held accountable for his actions. The internal investigation that followed was lengthy. More than a year passed before any resolution was announced. During that time, Marcus continued working at the Oasis Inn. Though he found himself tensing every time a police car pulled into the parking lot, he wondered if Officer Russo would return, if there would be retaliation for the complaint, if he had made a mistake by speaking up. But Marcus had not made a mistake. The investigation confirmed everything he had reported. It found that Officer Russo had detained a person who clearly did not match the description of the suspect. It found that his repeated questions about the suspect's race suggested he was unwilling to accept information that contradicted his assumptions. It found that his failure to apologize or acknowledge his error reflected poorly on the department. In September of 2021, more than a year after the incident, Officer Daniel Russo resigned from the Chandler Police Department. As part of his resignation, he voluntarily surrendered his law enforcement certification. This meant he could not simply move to another department and continue his career. His time as a police officer was over. For Marcus Thompson, the resignation was bittersweet. On one hand, it meant the officer would never again be in a position to treat someone the way he had treated Marcus. On the other hand, it felt inadequate. A resignation is not an admission of wrongdoing. Surrendering a certification is not the same as facing real consequences. The man who had pointed a gun at Marcus, who had forced him to the ground in front of his workplace, who had humiliated him in front of his manager, would never face criminal charges, never stand before a judge, never be required to explain his actions in a court of law. Still, it was something. It was more than many victims of police misconduct ever receive. And Marcus took what comfort he could from knowing that his decision to speak up had mattered. We have now examined 4 cases in detail, 4 encounters between citizens and law enforcement officers, 4 instances where the badge was used not to protect but to harm, 4 outcomes where accountability was eventually achieved, though never quickly or easily enough. What connects these stories? What patterns emerge when we look at them side by side? The first and most obvious pattern is mistaken identity, or more accurately, deliberate misidentification. In every case, the officer detained someone who was clearly not the person they should have been looking for. Michael Brennan was accused of driving infractions that had never occurred. Ryan Chen was treated as a suspect when he was the victim who had called for help. Harold Simmons was ejected from a store for attempting to make a purchase. Marcus Thompson was detained despite obviously being an employee rather than the armed suspect in the dispatch report. How does this keep happening? Part of the answer lies in training, or the lack thereof. Officers are taught to take control of situations, to establish authority, to act decisively. These are not bad instincts in genuinely dangerous situations, but they become dangerous themselves when applied indiscriminately, when the drive to establish control overrides the obligation to assess accurately. Another part of the answer lies in bias, both conscious and unconscious. We saw this most clearly in Marcus Thompson's case, where the officer repeatedly questioned dispatch about the suspect's race, seemingly unable to accept that a white man could be responsible for the crime. But bias operates in subtler ways too. The assumption that someone with an attitude must be guilty of something. The belief that resistance, even confused and frightened resistance, justifies escalation. The tendency to see certain people as threats and others as victims, regardless of the actual evidence. The second pattern is the failure to de-escalate. In every case, there were opportunities to step back, to ask questions, to reassess. Michael Brennan tried to explain that the statute did not apply to private property. Ryan Chen tried to identify himself as the 911 caller. Harold Simmons tried to show the money he had brought to pay for the bicycle. Marcus Thompson tried to point to his employee name tag. In every case, the officer refused to listen. De-escalation is a skill. It requires patience, empathy, and a willingness to consider that your initial assessment might be wrong. It requires treating citizens as human beings rather than obstacles to be controlled. And it requires ego management, the ability to back down from a position without feeling that your authority has been undermined. These officers lacked that skill. They escalated when they should have paused. They shouted when they should have listened. They arrested when they should have released. And in doing so, they transform minor encounters into traumatic events that will stay with their victims for years. The third pattern is the importance of body cameras. Every one of these cases was resolved because there was footage. The footage showed what really happened. It contradicted the officers' narratives. It provided evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed. This is both encouraging and troubling. It is encouraging because it means that accountability is possible when there is objective documentation, but it is troubling because it raises the question of how many similar incidents occur without cameras. How many citizens have been wrongly arrested, wrongly charged, wrongly convicted because there was no footage to reveal the truth? Body cameras are not a complete solution. Officers can turn them off. Departments can delay releasing footage. Prosecutors can decline to act even when the evidence is clear. But they are a step in the right direction. They are a tool that can help ensure that the truth has a fighting chance against official narratives. The fourth and final pattern is the eventual accountability. Every officer in these stories faced consequences, terminations, resignations, criminal charges. The system, however slowly and imperfectly, worked. But we should not be too quick to celebrate. These cases became public because of body camera footage that generated attention. They were prosecuted or administratively resolved because of pressure from media coverage and public outcry. For every case we hear about, there are dozens more that never make it to the news, where officers face no consequences, where victims have no recourse. The accountability we have seen in these stories is the exception, not the rule. It happened because specific circumstances aligned, because the footage was clear, because the misconduct was egregious, because advocates pushed for action. In the vast majority of cases, none of these factors are present, and officers who abuse their power continue to serve with impunity. What can be done? How do we move from exceptional accountability to systematic accountability? Part of the answer is policy reform, requiring body cameras to be active during all citizen encounters with severe penalties for officers who turn them off, creating independent review boards that are not staffed by current or former law enforcement, ending qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protects officers from civil liability even when they violate constitutional rights. Part of the answer is cultural change within law enforcement, hiring practices that screen for empathy and emotional intelligence, not just physical fitness and obedience. Training that emphasizes de-escalation and communication, not just tactics and control. Leadership that values community relationships over arrest statistics. And part of the answer is engagement from all of us, watching the footage, sharing the stories, demanding better from those who are supposed to serve and protect, making it clear that abuse of power will not be tolerated, that we are paying attention, that the cameras are rolling even when officers think no one is watching. What do you think needs to change? After hearing these 4 stories, what reforms would make the biggest difference? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below with your ideas. Share this video with others who care about these issues. And if you have not already, please subscribe to the channel. The more people who hear these stories, the harder it becomes for misconduct to stay hidden in the shadows. As we come to the end of this exploration, I want to return to where we started, the moment of decision. That split second where an officer chooses how to exercise the enormous power they have been given. Every day across this country, officers make decisions that align with their training and their oath. They approach situations with professionalism. They treat citizens with respect. They de-escalate when tensions rise. They protect and serve in the truest sense of those words. But also, every day, officers make decisions like the ones we have examined today. They let ego override judgment. They let bias override evidence. They let the desire for control override the commitment to justice. The difference between these 2 types of officers is not always obvious from the outside. They wear the same uniforms. They carry the same badges. They have access to the same power. Only in the moment of encounter does the truth reveal itself. Michael Brennan, Ryan Chen, Harold Simmons, Marcus Thompson. 4 ordinary people who found themselves on the wrong side of that moment. 4 people who did nothing wrong but were treated as criminals anyway. 4 people whose stories might have disappeared if not for the cameras that captured everything. Their stories matter, not because they are unique, but because they are representative. Because for every name we know, there are thousands we do not. Because the abuse of power is not an aberration, but a pattern. And because patterns can only be broken when they are seen clearly, examined honestly, and confronted directly. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about these issues. The badge is supposed to be a symbol of protection. When it becomes a weapon, all of us are diminished. But when we demand accountability, when we insist on justice, when we refuse to look away, we take a small step toward reclaiming what that badge should mean. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop asking questions about power and how it is used.